Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. Nearly 10 years ago, one of the worst mass atrocities in recent times took place in Sri Lanka during the final days of that country's long civil war. In May 2009, tens of thousands of people were killed by Sri Lankan armed forces over the course of just a few days. The military sought to deal a final blow to an insurgent group known as the Tamil Tigers, but in the process they killed as many as 40,000 people, the vast majority of whom were civilians. No one has been brought to justice for this crime against humanity, and that lack of accountability for those crimes is a key factor that my guest, Cronin Furman, argues is contributing to political instability in Sri Lanka today. Cronin Furman is an assistant professor of human rights in the Department of Political Science at the University College London. In this conversation, she explains what happened during the final days of that civil war when this massacre occurred. We then discuss how the forces that carried out that crime against humanity are posing a big challenge to the political life of Sri Lanka, which entered an extremely tumultuous period this fall in which two people claimed to be prime minister at the same time. We kick off our conversation discussing the Sri Lankan Civil War and its brutal end days before having a longer conversation about the ways in which the lack of accountability for those crimes are undermining the political stability of Sri Lanka today. A quick note before we begin. Big thank you to everyone who has been writing me, sending me your suggestions of people to interview or topics I should cover. I know I say this a lot, but I really do love hearing from you. I put this podcast out for you. Yes, you who is listening to me right now. So if you have a suggestion about something you want me to cover, if you're just curious about something in the world and want me to explore deeper, chances are other people feel that same way. So send me an email and let me know what's on your mind. You can use the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com to reach me, or hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. All right, now here is my conversation with Professor Cronin Furman.
So for over a quarter of a century, the Sri Lankan state fought a civil war against a separatist Tamil insurgency called the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. The kind of motivation for the conflict was that in post-independent Sri Lanka, Tamils, who are about a quarter of the population, were not afforded the same rights as the Sinhalese majority. And, this led to repeated kind of pogroms against the Tamil community, as well as ongoing repression. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Tamil resistance turned militant. And the group that kind of moved to the forefront of the resistance, the LTTE, waged a civil war against the state. And, this lasted until 2009.
Yeah, it was a particularly long and bloody and brutal civil war, but the brutality of the civil war seemed to have come to a really, profound head in May 2009. Can you describe the circumstances of the very end, the last days of this conflict?
The government that came to power in 2006 in Sri Lanka swore that they were going to end this long civil war, and launched a particularly coordinated and massive ground assault on the LTT, which had been holding territory in northeast Sri Lanka. And by late 2008, they had pushed all the way up into northeastern Sri Lanka and were driving the LTT and all of the Tamil civilians that lived in that area out towards the coast. And what happened in the final 4 months of the war was that this population of more than 300,000 civilians eventually got compressed into this very small area. And people were obviously, wasn't the entire 300,000 group that ended up there at the end. But, when we talk about mass atrocities at the end of Sri Lanka's civil war, what we're talking about is something that happened in May of 2009.
And essentially you had this large number of civilians in which there were probably some militant fighters mixed, but basically trapped in a pretty small area along a beach. And they were basically sort of sitting ducks. And there was like this kind of free fire zone, it seemed, in which the Sri Lankan military just sort of attacked this mass of civilians that were trapped on this beach.
Yeah, so this is tens of thousands of civilians trapped in an area that's about the size of New York Central Park. And the Sri Lankan government had repeatedly, over the final weeks and months of the war, declared what it called no-fire zones. And what has emerged in the aftermath of the war is that government forces shelled these no-fire zones, shelled hospitals, shelled other civilian targets.
And this is well documented. I mean, there have been lots and lots of reports
extremely well documented
that
at this point.
that discuss this kind of mass atrocity perpetrated by the Sri Lankan government.
Yes, and a panel of experts appointed by the former Secretary General of the UN estimated that 40,000 civilians were killed by this illegal shelling of civilian targets.
So this happened nearly 10 years ago, but recently there was a new report detailing and using some interesting statistical analysis to find that there were some 500 individuals forcibly disappeared. And, you sent me a message over Twitter kind of highlighting this report to me, explaining its significance. And I guess my question to you is, you had this situation where 400,000 people were killed, 40,000 people were killed. Why is this new report about the enforced disappearance of 500 people so sort of significant contemporaneously right now?
Yeah. So after the LTT surrendered, the government took custody of all of the civilians that had been left in this third no-fire zone. And when you talk to people who were present in those last few days, they say that they handed over their son, their husband, their daughter, their brother to the military and never saw them again. And there are thousands and thousands of Tamil civilians in northeastern Sri Lanka with stories like this, stories of a loved one disappearing into military custody. But the Sri Lankan government has denied committing atrocities. For a long time, the immediate post-war regime insisted that there had actually been zero civilian casualties to this war. Eventually, they did admit that some people might have died by accident. But this is a culture of absolute denial of intentional violation of human rights. And what that means is that everything about this event has been heavily contested in Sri Lankan politics for the last 10 years.
So even though we as international observers, know that there's no doubt that there were these huge mass atrocities that occurred at the tail end of this war, this is something that's vigorously denied by the government?
Categorically denied by the government. And, what's particularly concerning is that everyday citizens believe these lies. So I've had numerous conversations with Sinhalese civilians in the South who, when pressed on this issue, will say that, for instance, the video evidence of war crimes is forged, that these are, Tamils dressed up in Sri Lankan army uniforms pretending to commit atrocities. And anyone in the international community who, speaks out about these events or, says that they have evidence that they occurred, is immediately derided and dismissed as a terrorist sympathizer.
I mean, on that point, I recall after that UN report came out suggesting that 40,000 people were killed, that there was an effigy of Ban Ki-moon burned in the street of Colombo. Now, Ban Ki-moon is not someone who arouses like any passions in anyone he's ever met. Most mild-mannered sort of diplomat and secretary general, yet they were burning his effigy, and that to me sort of seemed like, wow, this is an intense reaction.
Yeah, I mean, there is this perception on the ground that international interest in what happened at the end of the war is an incursion onto Sri Lanka's sovereignty. It's unfair. It's Western imperialism. So there is this really kind of categorical refusal to admit that this happened.
Well, okay, so then what is the significance of this new report about the 500 enforced disappearance?
So this is the first rigorous statistical estimate that we have about any of this. So, obviously, we know from satellite imagery, we know from testimony of the victims that horrible things happened. But that is a different kind of knowing about mass atrocities than a rigorous and transparent estimate. And what's happened here is that the Human Rights Data Analysis Group has been able to use partial lists of people who went missing in military custody over this 3-day period to assemble an estimate of the total population that this happened to. And that's really important because, they're not an advocacy group. Right? They're not representatives of the victim community. These are statisticians who have done this type of work across a variety of violent and post-conflict contexts, and their methods and their reputation is unimpeachable.
So they just bring actual hard evidence in terms of statistical analysis around these enforced disappearances that potentially throws a wrench in denials that these things ever occurred.
Which is not to say that this will solve the problem of denial or mean that this is no longer contentious, but it's a very different kind of evidence than, the testimony of a handful of people, right? Because, if you have 10 individuals testifying to something horrible that happened to them, and you don't want to believe what they're saying, it's very easy to kind of cast doubt on the individual story or, for instance, suggest that what happened to that person is not representative of a broader trend. Mm-hmm. But what we have here is evidence of the trend.
So we're speaking in the midst of this profound political roller coaster in Sri Lanka right now. Can you, number one, describe for people who do not follow Sri Lankan politics, what is happening, what has happened? I take it since about October of 2018 till about mid-December of 2018, and how sort of what happened and the atrocities and and how the government and others in society approaches the atrocities that occurred at the end of the Civil War are impacting domestic politics currently.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
I've given you a big assignment there, Professor.
Yeah, right. Yes. Let me just explain Sri Lanka real quick.
Yeah.
So, in late October, the president of Sri Lanka, rather shockingly, announced that he was sacking his prime minister and appointing his predecessor, Mahinda Rajapaksa, in his place.
And it was the Rajapaksa and his brother who perpetrated these atrocities. Let's remind people, right?
Yeah. So Mahinda Rajapaksa was president of Sri Lanka, and his brother Gotabaya was in charge of the security sector during the kind of last phase of the Civil War, and therefore they have kind of ultimate command responsibility for the atrocities that occurred. Mm-hmm. In 2015, Rajapaksa was unexpectedly voted out of office in favor of actually one of his former ministers who defected to form a coalition with the opposition party. And, this was a huge surprise to everyone at the time. it looked like the Rajapaksas were consolidating their hold on power and going to become, a lifetime dictatorship. And, no one anticipated that they were going to be bounced from office in a, relatively free and fair election. And one of the things that happened in the aftermath of that election is that the new president, Maithripala Sirisena, repeatedly alleged that Rajapaksa was a threat to his life. That, if he would have lost the election, he would have been killed. So, it was quite a surprise to see him suddenly announce that he was going to appoint Rajapaksa to be his prime minister.
Because previously the prime minister was kind of like a more of a liberal guy, right?
Yeah. So the coalition that took power in 2015 was quite a big tent coalition, including, and it was an alliance with the opposition party, the UNP. So they were kind of strange bedfellows from the beginning. But what's kind of really important here is that according to kind of constitutional experts from Sri Lanka, the president didn't actually have the power to sack his prime minister. So this was an unlawful action on his part. And what it led to was, weeks of uncertainty, protests, and wrangling among the political elites of Sri Lanka.
And there's basically like two governments for a while, right? There was one by the ousted prime minister and one by the Rajapaksa regime.
Yeah, so the ousted prime minister refused to step down, on the grounds that this was an unconstitutional action and that he had not been deposed from power. And at the same time, Mahinda Rajapaksa set about forming a government in his supposed capacity as the new prime minister. And, ultimately this went to the courts to resolve. We saw a gratifying display of judicial independence. We also saw that Mahinda Rajapaksa was not actually able to secure the necessary votes in parliament, to kind of stabilize his position. And so, what happened last week was that Rajapaksa announced his resignation, and the president kind of very grudgingly accepted the kind of return of the prime minister that he tried to kick out of office.
And so I should say we're speaking at the end of December. So, but right now it seems the situation is moderately stable compared to what it was before when you had these kind of competing prime ministers. But I guess I'm wondering, what does the end of the civil war and the atrocities committed and perhaps the lack of any sort of, punitive measures or accountability for those atrocities have to do with kind of the current political dynamics of Sri Lanka?
So, what the present instability stems from the fact that Mahinda Rajapaksa retains tremendous popularity in southern Sri Lanka among Sinhalese Buddhist citizens.
Which is the majority population.
Which is the majority population, approximately 70% of the population. Rajapaksa remains tremendously popular in the south. And that's disturbing because he is a war criminal who has not been brought to justice. And most of us would not think that someone who has perpetrated mass atrocities that led to the deaths of perhaps 40,000 civilians is a fit person to be returned to high political office. But because Sri Lanka has never reckoned with the crimes of the past, he remains a powerful political force in the country today, 10 years after these crimes were perpetrated. And, that's not only concerning from a moral perspective, it's also concerning on a very practical level. Because people are afraid of what might happen if he comes back. In the 4 years since he was displaced from office, the promised reforms of the new government haven't really materialized. And what that means is that the repressive apparatus is still in place. And there is the very real risk that if Rajapaksa comes back to power, we will see a resurgence of very serious violations of human rights that were commonplace during his regime.
And he came very, very close to coming back to power, just this past fall.
He came very close to coming back to power this fall and likely will be extremely competitive in the next round of elections.
I guess, so what's the best way forward? I mean, obviously, he is a war criminal, ought to be ousted, but there's no real kind of mechanism, it seems, to remove him from the political scene. And it seems also, as you said, that the lack of just popular understanding or popular, just like general, know-how or of what happened at the end of the Civil War, means that he does have this base of support. And frankly, if his base is really hardcore nationalists, they might not even care that all these Tamils were murdered at the end of the war.
Yeah, and that's what makes Sri Lanka such a hard case, for accountability and for human rights. Tamil diaspora, Tamil representatives of the community on the ground have been campaigning for justice for 10 years now. They've asked for everything from an international criminal court prosecution, to a hybrid court sitting in Sri Lanka to prosecute these crimes. And unfortunately, Sri Lanka is not a member of the International Criminal Court. It's protected on the Security Council by its patron China. So the only really feasible path to justice is a domestic one. But as we've just discussed, the domestic politics of the situation make that really unlikely. And until the majority population in the South comes to accept the reality of what happened at the end of the war, I think we'll continue to see Sri Lanka characterized by a culture of impunity.
Well, Kate, thank you so much for your time. As always, I always love hearing from you. I always love getting messages from you. I always know it's going to result in an interesting conversation. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Kate, who I feel like I've known for a long time. I don't think we've actually met in person, but she has been in the blogging world nearly as long as I have. And so we've sort of crossed virtual paths many, many times. And I know she's been on this show before. As I said at the end, I always love hearing from her. She's always up to interesting work. As always, big thank you to the University of Manchester's Global Development Institute for being an ongoing supporter of the show, a content partner. Expect a new episode from that content partnership very soon. And if you are with an organization and want your content that is relevant to other global affairs nerds talked about on this podcast, just send me an email. We'll talk about it. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.